Hello, my name is Michael Robertson, and welcome to our little foray into family history. In this episode, I would like to talk a little bit about my third great grandparents on my father's side of the family. That would be my great 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 grandfather Joseph Robertson and his wife Rosanna Armstrong. Now, Joseph and Rosanna were both born in the late 18th century, and in the early 19th century were living in Glasgow, Scotland. So I'd like to take a look and see what we can find in the records and maybe get a little idea of what their life was like in Glasgow at that time. Perhaps the best place to begin this genealogical journey is with information that can be found in an old family Bible. In this Bible, there's a handwritten family register that includes the names of Joseph Robertson, his wife Rosanna Armstrong, and their 12 children. It records the dates of their birth and in many cases the dates of their death. It notes that Joseph Robertson was born on November 25th of 1796 and that Rosanna was born on April 12th of 1798. There's also a note in the upper right corner that says this information was written down in January of 1862. So I wanted to look back in the records and see what else we could find out about this family. And the earliest record I could find was a marriage record from the barony parish of the Church of Scotland. It notes that Joseph Robertson married Rosanna Armstrong in May of 1817. It indicates the family was living in Parkhead, which is a section of Glasgow, and that Joseph was a collier. He was working in a coal mine. Another early record that we have from this family is the first census that was conducted in Scotland in 1841. On this census record, it's noted that the family is now living in Palmady, which is another section of Glasgow. It notes that Joseph and Rosanna were living with their sons John, Thomas, Joseph, George, William, David, and James. Now, other information that we can get from this census record includes the ages of the people involved. We can see Joseph and Rosanna at 45 and 43 years old, respectively, in 1841. And their children that they had at the time include their oldest John, who was 23 years old, down to their youngest James at 5 years old. It also notes the occupation of anybody working in the household. And everybody around Joseph was a coal miner at this time. Now, although the census taker failed to note that Joseph himself was a coal miner on this particular entry, we do know that Joseph was a coal miner from the marriage record in 1817. Now, this also notes that the four oldest children, John, Thomas, Joseph, and George, were also coal miners, Joseph being 14 and George just being 12 years old at the time. There is a column that indicates if they were born in Scotland, whether they were born in the county or not. Now, this county was Lanarkshire, where this census was conducted. So if they were born in Lanarkshire, there would be a yes indicated in this column, and it indicates that Joseph was born in Lanarkshire, but his first son, John, it indicates was not born in Lanarkshire. That means that John was born elsewhere in Scotland. But all of the other children listed on the census of Joseph and Rosanna were born in Lanarkshire. Rosanna herself, the final column indicates if they were not born in Scotland, where they were born, and the I indicates Rosanna was born in Ireland. Likely Northern Ireland, as Armstrong is a fairly common name in Northern England, Northern Ireland, and Southern Scotland. Now, sadly, these records, and in particular the record from the family Bible, show that the first four daughters that were born to Joseph and Rosanna all died before reaching the age of 2 years old. Now, the fact that the census record indicates their first son John was born elsewhere in Scotland than Lanarkshire might not be as big a deal as it would seem. If we take a look at some maps of the area from around that time, I can show you what I'm talking about. Before we look at some of those older maps, I just want to do a quick overview for anybody who might not be familiar. Scotland sits in the northern part of the United Kingdom. Now, the United Kingdom reached its current form in 1707 with the unification of the parliaments. The UK consists of Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. If we look at Scotland in the north, it consists of the mainland, the Western Isles that include the Inner and Outer Hebrides, to the north of the mainland, the Orkney Islands, and then well to the north, the Shetland Islands. If we focus in on the Scottish mainland, we can see the three geographic regions here. To the north and northwest, we have the Scottish Highlands. In the middle, we have the central lowlands with Edinburgh on the east and Glasgow on the west. And in the south, we have the southern uplands that run along the border with England to the south. If we zoom in a little closer to the central lowlands, you can see some of the political subdivisions on this map. You can see the counties or shires that are marked on the map. You can see Lanarkshire here in this area. And you can also see the River Clyde that kind of flows from Lanark up to the northwest through Glasgow and to the Firth of Clyde. Now, there are also other political subdivisions, the parishes, and now the council districts that aren't shown on this map. And these political subdivision boundaries have kind of changed over time. So we'll take a look at some maps from the time that the family was living in Glasgow and see what they can tell us. One of the first historic maps that we want to take a look at is one by John Thompson done in 1832. Now, one thing to pay attention to when looking at some of these old maps is that north may not necessarily be oriented towards the top of the page. So often we have to pay attention to some of the land features to kind of orient ourselves as we go from one map to another. Now on this map we can see the built-up area of Glasgow, kind of in this area here, and the River Clyde coming through and flowing from the southeast towards the northwest, towards the Firth of Clyde. If we zoom in on the Glasgow area of the John Thompson map, we can see the built-up part of the city right in this vicinity here, and the River Clyde that kind of twists and turns coming into that built-up area, flowing towards the northwest. Now, to the east of that built-up area, we can see Barony Parish in this vicinity over here. And kind of to the south and east, we'll see a big hairpin turn on the Clyde River right in here. And just to the east of that, we'll see Parkhead, which is where Joseph and Rosanna were living at the time they got married in 1817. There is a coal works nearby right here. That's likely where Joseph was working at that time. Now, just before it flows into the built-up area of Glasgow, the Clyde River takes kind of an S-turn. And right on the south side of that S-turn, we can see the area of Palmady. And this is where the family was living in 1841 when the census was conducted. Now, although I did not find any birth records for Joseph and Rosanna's first son, John, who was born in 1818, or either of their first two daughters that were born within a few years of John, I did find a birth record for Thomas, who was born in 1822. Now, the birth record for Thomas was in the Church of Scotland records in Gorbals Parish. So if we look at this area that's outlined in this thinner blue line here, this shows where Gorbals Parish is located on the south of the River Clyde in Glasgow. Now, the thicker green line that kind of runs down through this area here shows the next county over, which is Renfrew. So this would be Renfrewshire in this area on this side of that green line. And we can see a little protuberance that kind of runs up by Gorbals Parish right to the area of Palmady. So depending on which side of the street you were on or which street you were on in Palmady, you could have been either in Lanarkshire or Renfrewshire. Now, it is possible that since it was very common for coal miners to live in housing rented from that owned by the coal company, that when Joseph and Rosanna first moved down to the Palmady area, they were actually living in Renfrewshire, and that was where John was born. So that would explain why on the census he would be marked as not being born in Lanarkshire, but still being born in Scotland. Now, it's possible that after the family started having children, they moved into different housing, and that the children that were born subsequently were in other housing that was actually in Lanarkshire. Another map of the time that we can take a look at is a slightly less cluttered map done by the parliamentary commissioners for the House of Commons when they were working on the Reform Act of 1832. Now we can see this map has north oriented a little differently. It's up and to the left in this case as opposed to up and to the right on the John Thompson map. But we can see the River Clyde flowing through the built-up area of Glasgow here, and that S-bend that it takes coming into that built-up area, and then the hairpin turn off to the southeast here with Parkhead just right by that, and then down by that S-bend, Palmady being down in that area. Another good map of the area from this time is one done by Smith, Cleland, and Wood in 1822. And on this map we can see a very good depiction of Gorbals Parish on the south side of the Clyde River here. We can see the built-up area of Glasgow on either side of the Clyde. And then down by this S-bend here we can see the lands of Palmady, where the family was living at the time of the census in 1841. Now going towards the more built-up area of Glasgow from Palmady, we come to the lands of Little Govan, and in particular a place called Govan Hill. And that's significant because it's in the vicinity of Govan Hill that the coal mine was where Joseph was working at that time. Now continuing on from there, we can see the property of Hutchinson's Hospital and the Hutchison Town section of Glasgow. Now just across the River Clyde from Palmady and this area, we see Glasgow Green, which was kind of a big park-like area at the time. Now I'm not sure if the family still had any relatives in the Barony area, which would have been across the river and about 2 miles away as the crow would fly from Palmady. But the two main ways to get across the Clyde River would have been the Rutherglen Bridge down in this area here, or the Hutchison Bridge going from the Hutchison Town section of Glasgow up across the Clyde here. Now I did come across some drawings of those bridges from the time, so we can get a little idea of what things would have looked like back in the day. The Rutherglen Bridge here, and then the Hutchison Bridge looking down along the Glasgow Green from that side of the river there. Now, all of the subsequent children born to Joseph and Rosanna after Thomas have their birth records at the Hutchison Town Relief Church rather than the Church of Scotland in Gorbals Parish. And the Hutchison Town Relief Church was on Hospital Street here in Hutchison Town. And that later became the United Presbyterian Church of Glasgow. In looking at these family history records, there's nothing that I found that really does anything to identify the parents of either Rosanna Armstrong or her husband Joseph Robertson. Now, perhaps I should take this opportunity to clarify something about Joseph Robertson, because as I was doing the research, I noticed a number of people identified the parents of Joseph Robertson as being a Mary Kennedy and another Joseph Robertson. Now, I did find in the Barony Parish records, in the Church of Scotland records there, a Joseph Robertson who was born to Mary Kennedy and Joseph Robertson in 1798. Now, when I looked at the birth dates of the children recorded in the family Bible and matched those with other birth records that I could find, which was for 9 of the 12 children that I found other records for, all of those birth dates match exactly. So there's every reason to think that the birth date recorded in the family Bible for Joseph Robertson and for Rosanna Armstrong are just as accurate. So I also noticed that this Mary Kennedy and Joseph Robertson had another child named Christian in 1796. And I thought, well, maybe someone just mixed up the birth dates and wrote the wrong birth date down in the family Bible. But when you look closer, although the years match, the month and the day for the birthday of Christian don't match that of Joseph. So I think the only reasonable conclusion we can draw here is that the Joseph Robertson who was born to Mary Kennedy and Joseph Robertson in 1798 is not the Joseph Robertson recorded as being born in 1796 in the family Bible and who married Rosanna Armstrong. Although we may not know exactly who Joseph Sr.'s parents are, it is likely that Joseph's ancestors, he being a Robertson, come from the traditional lands of Clan Donachie, which includes the Robertsons. Now, the lands of Clan Donachie are in Perthshire, to the north and east of Glasgow. Those lands would run from Rannoch Moor in the west, along Loch Rannoch, to the northeast by Struan and Blair Athol, and down to the south and east through Aberfeldy and down towards Dunkeld. Now, those lands were initially granted in the mid-1400s by King James II as a reward for the clan chief at the time capturing the murderer of his father, King James I. But that's another story altogether. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about this time in the first part of the 19th century was that the Industrial Revolution was really picking up steam, so to speak. And what powered that Industrial Revolution was coal. Although steam engines had been around for quite some time when Joseph Robertson was born in 1796, it wasn't until the development of the high-pressure steam engine that the Industrial Revolution really took off. That led to the invention of the first rail steam locomotive in 1804. By the time Joseph and Rosanna were married in 1817, the demand for coal was skyrocketing. More coal was needed for the railroads that were developing. More coal was needed for the steamships that were being built across the oceans. And more coal was needed for the burgeoning industries, like the cotton mills that were springing up all over Glasgow. More and more people were needed to work in the coal mines. The life of a coal miner was not easy. 12-hour days, 6 days a week were commonplace. A coal miner's day would start at 5 o'clock in the morning and would go until 7 in the evening. Coal miners would get an hour in the morning for breakfast and then an hour again in the afternoon for dinner. As more and more people came to work in the mines got bigger and bigger, and the mines became an ever more dangerous place to work. If we take a closer look at the birth record of Thomas Robertson, who was born on October 12th in the year of 1822, we'll notice it says the family was in fireworks. I started to wonder if maybe the family had moved away and they were working in another area for a while. Then I came across a history of the Govan Hill area, and that said that Fireworks Village was actually the name given to where the coal miners were living at Dixon's Colliery. So we'll take a little look at the history of Dixon's Colliery and how that developed, and how the family may have been living at that time. In the latter half of the 1700s, a man by the name of Colin Ray was a big landowner in the Little Govan area, or Govan as they say in Glasgow. Now, Colin Ray was the first man to begin large-scale mining operations in this area. In the 1770s, there was a man who came up from England by the name of William Smith Dixon, and Colin Ray brought him on to be a manager for his coal mines. Now, as coal mining operations progressed, it tended to spoil the lands around the mine for farming, and that made these lands cheaper. So William Dixon saw an opportunity here and started buying up the land around the mine that could later be used in mining operations. So William Dixon was made a partner in this coal mine, and when Colin Ray died, William Dixon bought out his widow, and the mine became known as Dixon's Colliery. As the demand for coal increased, so did Mr. Dixon's wealth. William Dixon built himself a large house on top of the highest hill in the area, and it was known as Govan Hill. As more workers were needed to operate his coal mines, more housing was needed for those workers. And the housing that he built in the area became known as Fireworks, or Fireworks Village. Now we can see Fireworks Village on this map from 1816. And we can also see nearby the house that Mr. Dixon built on Govan Hill. As previously mentioned, it was very common for coal miners to live in housing that was owned by the coal companies. Not only did this mean that the coal miners would be close by and it wouldn't take them a long time to get to the mine and begin their actual workday, but it meant that the rents that these miners and their families paid would come back to the coal company. Often also there was a company store that would sell goods to the miners and their families on account, and any account balances would be automatically deducted from wages that would be paid to the miners. Now in some cases, these coal mines would actually make more money selling housing and goods to the workers and their families than they would make from selling coal. Now Fireworks, or Fireworks Village as it was known, got its name from the steam engine that was used to bring the coal from Dixon's Colliery up to the surface. And this is where the family of Joseph and Rosanna was living when their son Thomas was born in 1822. Now also in 1822, William Dixon Sr. died, and his son, William Jr., took over. Now, William Dixon Jr. continued to expand the coal mining operations, and eventually the mines encroached on the house that Mr. Dixon Sr. had built at Govan Hill. By the end of the 1830s, the foundation started to give way, and the house was no longer livable. Now, in 1839, William Dixon Jr. built an iron operation at this facility as well. It was then that the area became known as Dixon's Blazes, because the fires from this iron operation would light up the night sky for miles around. I came across this hand sketch of Dixon's Blazes, showing the layout of the area based on descriptions from the time. It shows where the iron furnaces were located, where Fireworks Village was, where the coal miners and their families were living, the lands of Palmady, and its situation to some of the surrounding areas, like Gorbals to the north here. Now I also found a sketch from William Simpson from 1849 that shows Main Street in Gorbals, and it kind of gives us an idea of what life would have been like and the area would have looked like at the time the family was living there in the 1840s. One last drawing that I came across showing Dixon's Blazes was probably done in the 1840s, and it shows the ironworks in the background, and in front of the ironworks we can see Fireworks Village, where the coal miners would have been living at that time. So here I am back at the spinning wheel, and I couldn't help but think, talking about Dixon's Blazes, that it kind of reminded me of some of my own experiences as a child growing up in the vicinity of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Now, this would have been back in the late 1960s, but I remember as a child, if the family would go into the city and would be driving back at night to where we lived in the South Hills, or South Hills as they say in Pittsburgh, that would drive past these steel mills in Homestead and along the Monongahela River, that sometimes would have these flames shooting out of the top of them, these big flares that would bathe the whole area in an orange glow. And I remember being impressed as a child looking out the car window and seeing these big flames shooting out of the stacks on top of these steel mills. And I couldn't help but think that maybe, even though we were on opposite sides of the Industrial Revolution between the 1840s and the 1960s, that perhaps it was a little bit like what the kids of Joseph and Rosanna saw when they were living in the vicinity of Dixon's Blazes. Now, speaking of the children of Joseph and Rosanna, I would like to go through them all, and that means taking a look back at that family Bible. So looking at the children in the family Bible here, we have mentioned John, who was born in March of 1818. The next child was Rebecca, who was born in May of 1819, and was just about 6 months old when she died. Their next child was Elizabeth, who was born in September of 1821, and Elizabeth was not quite 1 month old when she died as well. Thomas Robertson was born in October of 1822. Then there was another daughter, also named Elizabeth, born in February of 1825. Now, Elizabeth was a little over 1 year old when she died. Joseph Robertson was born in March of 1827. George Robertson was born in September of 1829. William Robertson was born in March of 1832. David Robertson was born in July of 1834. Now, David Robertson died in October of 1841 at the age of 7 years old. He died just a few months after that first census was taken in Scotland in 1841. The next child born was James Robertson in June of 1836. Then another daughter, Rosanna Robertson, who was born in May of 1838. Now, Rosanna lived to be over a year and a half before she died as well. Now, in 1843, John Robertson married Maria Ferguson, and they started their own household. The year 1844 was kind of a banner year for the Robertson family. In January, Joseph and Rosanna had their daughter, Isabella. Now, if we take a quick look at Isabella's birth record from the Hutchisontown Relief Church, we'll see that Joseph Robertson was still listed as being a coal miner at that time. Isabella was born when her mother was 46 years old, and the next youngest sibling to Isabella growing up would have been 7 years older than her, so she was really the baby of the family. In March of 1844, Joseph and Rosanna had their first grandchild, as John and Maria had their first child named Joseph. In 1846, John and Maria had their second child named James, and Thomas Robertson married Janet Scholar. Thomas and Janet had their first child, Jane, in 1847. So that brings us up through 1847 with the Robertson family and their children, all of whom were still living and working in the Glasgow area at this time. Although we did look at some of the conditions that affected the family of Joseph and Rosanna directly, I would like to take a look at the larger picture and maybe put some context around the time that Joseph and Rosanna were growing up and then after they got married and were raising their family. Now, 50 years prior to Joseph being born, the final defeat of the Jacobite uprising had happened at the Battle of Culloden. By the time Joseph was born in 1796, the Highland clearances were well underway. Lots of people who had worked the land with their clansmen for generations suddenly found themselves without a home and without any way to make a living. A lot of people had to take wage labor jobs in higher population areas or leave the country altogether. Between the year 1800 and the year 1850, the population of Glasgow quadrupled. It went from under 100,000 people in 1800 to nearly 400,000 by 1850. In the larger picture, when Joseph and Rosanna were growing up, Napoleon was waging war in Europe, and the United Kingdom had tried to regain some of the colonies that it had lost in the Americas. After they got married and started raising a family, there were revolutions on the continent of Europe that were trying to address some of the conditions that resulted from the peace of Prince Metternich after the Napoleonic Wars. And there was turmoil again in the 1830s. And by 1848, another wave of revolution swept through the continent of Europe that would result in some big changes. And 1848 was a year that would have some very big changes for the family of Joseph and Rosanna as well. And we'll talk about that in our next episode.